Close.
Well, welcome. Well, we almost got it that time. Welcome back to Sophomoros. I've got with me my cousin Kevin again, and we're going to be talking through the theology book that we've been walking through. Can These Bones Live? A Theology and Outline by Robert Jensen. We're going to be talking about chapter 2 today, and we're also going to be talking about episode 3 of Death Parade, which is an anime show that we're both kind of watching together, and we're kind of seeing if there are any themes that we can draw across the two mediums.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, because they're both. I mean, a book and a. How do you refer to that in the plural? Anyways, so we're gonna get into it today, but first, Kevin, how are you?
I'm good. How about you?
I'm tired. I'm a tired boy. This week has been crazy. We as a youth ministry, we've decided this year to create a silent film that we will be showing at our Christmas party this Sunday.
Wow.
So it's big. So all of the filming is done for it, and at this point, most of the editing is done for it. But this week I spent like 12 hours editing this film. And so I have been doing a lot of editing and a lot of putting the last pieces together to make sure that this party works out well. So I'm a tired boy.
Have you watched any of the great classics for inspiration, like Buster Keaton or any of that sort of thing?
I wish I could say I had. No. And when you think silent film, don't think like the guy on the piano. Not like one of those. It's more like it's like a dramatic silent film, and I play very moody guitar in the background. It's wonderful.
You know why that piano was there originally?
Why?
Because they didn't have audio. They hadn't figured out how to do audio and video together, so they shot the video and then they'd send a track to the film house, and there'd be a person with an actual piano in the back playing music, trying to keep it somewhat in sync with. Yeah, that's.
Oh, I feel
and then
stupid. I mean,
once
like,
they
that makes
figured
sense.
that out, then they actually started combining the two together. But that's why they were silent films.
That's crazy to think that there's some guy that like his timing will just mess up the entire movie. If you that's a lot of pressure, right? Because if you mess up a film, or if you mess up a musical piece midway through, like, you can kind of regain your composure, but like music fits with the theme of the so like, you know, let's say the Charlie Chaplin falls down and you hit it late, you know, you hit the piano note late. Now everybody's staring at you, and everyone hates you, and no one will ever love you again.
Yeah, well, I mean, you do the first couple of shows, you're probably in a sweat, and then, you know, by the 100th, you're probably, like, just so ready to move on with your life.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I imagine that's funny to think about, just, like, these guys getting the pieces for the first time, you know, mailed in. And they're just so sweaty because it's opening night, right? Like,
yeah, this is a big one. Everyone's showing up for it. Oh, man.
That's scary. But okay, anyway, so
we already got sidetracked. I love it.
Oh yeah, this is good radio. We're developing this silent film, and our kids did a pretty good job. They kept with the script well. They improvised well. They acted well. And it's one of those things where, like, each of the little clips that I took, at the end of it, they're all laughing hysterically, right? So you have to, like, find the right point to cut the film so that you don't see them smirking.
Yep.
But yeah, I've got so much ridiculous footage on my phone. At this point, my iCloud storage is running full because I've got so many videos just, like, clogging up my storage. So, anyways. That's how I am. That was a long answer. I'm sorry.
There you go.
So, I don't know. Do we want to start with, like, briefing on Can These Bones Live, or do we want to start with Death Parade?
Start.
I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna do it as well.
Perpetually for the rest of this. But I'd say just maybe give a quick overview of this quick overview, which is chapter 2.
Yes, then that's good. So So this whole book, I think, is basically, I think we said last time, it's a series of lectures that were given that were kind of crystallized into a written format. And so, like, think the demographic here is like undergrad, right? So college freshmen who are taking a theology course, who maybe have no interest in theology whatsoever. So this is kind of his approach, is this very, like, he'll use big language here and there, but Jensen is not talking over anyone's head in the midst of this, which is nice. When I'm so used to reading people that are just like I have to spend like 30-40 minutes on a page trying to figure out what they're saying. Yeah. This is like a breath of fresh air. So, but this chapter, so chapter 2 of this book, is dedicated to kind of the starting point. So the last chapter that we read was the introduction and kind of the very, very brief overview, like the 30,000 square foot, or it's not square foot, 30,000 like feet in elevation overview of what the book was going to be about, and all the different topics. And this is kind of the start of the book, right? This is where he chooses to start. And I think that that's interesting, because where a theologian chooses to begin their theology says something about their theology, right? Mm-hmm. The first thing they choose to say will set up kind of the flavor for how they then go about the rest of their theology. So a lot of theologians in writing dogmatics or like a theology will begin with like a doctrine of God or a doctrine of Scripture. Those are usually what they start with, is like either we're gonna get down into the nitty-gritty of here's how like we know who God is, right, through the Scriptures, or we're gonna start with God himself, right? Like we're gonna start with the Trinity, we're gonna start with talking about Christology, that kind of stuff. God is, like sovereign, and like going through the attributes. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes that's called like theology proper, right? Is the study of like God himself, in his being. I think that it's interesting that Jensen chooses to start with Israel, and specifically begins not at creation either. So you'd think, like, okay, he's starting with the Scriptures. He's going with kind of a narrative approach. He's not going to talk systematically yet. He's going to kind of, break open the topic by following the storyline. So you'd think, well, okay, he'd start with Genesis 1. But he doesn't. He starts with Abraham. And he starts with this, like, kind of strange revelation of God to Abraham, and the call of Abraham, and like the weirdness of all of this, and like all the weird little stories that follow. And I love that, like, he uses this as his starting point for here's what we know about God. God is somebody that basically chooses a random person out in the wilderness and says, like, I'm gonna walk with you and I'm gonna bless you. Why? Well, who knows?
See, I disagreed with that position he took.
Go ahead.
I think God very explicitly says exactly why he picked Abraham. Or Abram. And it's in, of course, now that Bible App's decided that it's going to load the chapter with just blankness, which is fantastic. It's chapter 18. Yeah, in Genesis. If you're in another book, you're reading about a different person with the same name.
Genesis 18.
Genesis 18. It's the three chaps that show up all of a sudden to have a bit of a conversation, and Abraham notices, recognizes their divinity essentially from the start. Okay, it's around 17, I think. Let's see, because of course I had it pulled up and then it left when everything went blank. There we go. Okay, 19. Difficulties. Yes. So Genesis 18, verse 19. For I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. So that is he is saying, I picked him for this specific reason right there.
Yeah.
It wasn't random. It was intentional.
but here's a bigger question. So if that's pretty late in the story of Abraham already. So Genesis 18, he's not
crusty.
Has he had crusty. His name changed yet? Does it call him Abraham?
It is Abraham.
So at that
he's had his name changed. He's been circumcised, but this is him finding out the details about him actually having a kid from Sarah.
Yes. So in Genesis 11 is where you first meet Abram.
Yes.
And it's actually just out of a lineage, right? So it's genealogy from Shem down to Abram. And then Abram, it basically talks about this guy who fathered Abram, Terah, right? Terah fathers Abram and Nahor and Haran, and it says they settle in Haran, and they live there 205 years, and then you move to the next chapter, and then it says the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I'll show you." I think that might be what he's getting at there. Is like there's almost no exposition as to why it's this dude, and not why not Nahor or literally any of the other people on planet Earth, right? What makes this guy special? And so once he's already accepted the call, then you can say, well, there's you could say like a development in the why, and maybe you could say retrospectively that all along this is what God had in mind. I mean, maybe you have to say that due to like omniscience, right? But
even just it's God seeing the potential in Abram, and I think it's him. The reason we're not given that God's perspective right off the bat is in part to get us to come to the understanding of who Abram is as he comes to the understanding of who he is. Because not all of these actions are necessarily something God wants to have happen, as we see with poor Pharaoh.
Yeah.
This is one of the pharaohs of Egypt I feel bad for because he had no clue what was coming, and it really wasn't his fault. But boy, did he pay the punishment for it.
Yeah.
And these are key moments in Abram and then later Abraham's life. That is, it's his discovery of who he is as a man, but it's also God shaping him into the man that God wants him to become. And so it's only once he gets to a certain point of his life where it can actually start to make sense that God starts revealing why he picked him in the first place.
Yeah. And you could maybe say that there's a similar through line there with Moses, right? Another one of God's elect that doesn't make sense why he's chosen, right? But he's chosen. Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. So maybe we do push back on Jensen there and say there is a why for Abraham.
I don't think it destroys the rest of what Jensen is trying to do.
It's a very passing comment that he makes, but I thought that was an interesting take. I still will hold that I think why Abram and not someone else, I think, is still a question, right? Why Abram is an easy question, like in the sense of like, what does God have in plan for this man? But why him and not someone else, I think, is still a question that goes unanswered for us.
I suppose it's that chicken and the egg thing of it's him because that's who God made him to be, but God made him to be because it was him thing.
Right.
It really doesn't have an answer per se.
The mystery of interacting with an omniscient being.
Yes.
Yeah.
I just try not to think about it too hard. Jensen himself, I think, just generally taking an approach of just sort of taking the Bible's word for itself. That doesn't necessarily mean he's ignoring the work that's being done in fields like archaeology, but he's saying for the purpose of what this whole discussion is of this book, that is not as helpful for us as simply looking at the Bible's description of itself and examining that of its own merits.
Yeah, he says that at one point. I have it highlighted. Let me see if I can find it. Where he basically says, oh yeah, here. So he says, of course this is on page...
who knows if we have the same pages?
Page 15, 13. Kindle's being weird. Oh, 15. Yeah, so page 15, it says, of course, we may ask if there really was an Abraham and his tribe. The best we can say, I think, is that the descriptions in Genesis of their way of life and their adventures fit with what we otherwise know of the conditions and migrations in that early part of the second millennium. Personally, I am always more inclined to trust in an ancient people's own account of themselves than what modern critical scholars may dream up as replacements for them. And that's a specific
I love
push
that line.
Against Enlightenment theology, right? Like that was now that doesn't necessarily mean that he's staking his entire reputation or faith on this, like, whether or not this story is historical. But I do think that that's a pushback against, you could say, the modernist approach, where it's like, we know what they really meant, and here's what they really meant, even though we're 2,000 years, or in this case maybe 3,500 years removed, and half a world removed, right? Like, there's the amount of hubris that goes into much critical theory is just, anyhow. So there was a bunch of little notes that I took in the midst of this. I think we can pause, though, and just say what he does in this chapter is walk through a brief history of Israel. Walks through, and I would say actually a pretty comprehensive one as far as balance goes, right? He covers all the bases. And he gives it this nice little, like, there's this way that Jensen talks that I really like, where and maybe this is just, like, I don't know, good storytelling, but he has a way of talking, a way of like describing the characters and making you kind of sympathize with the characters a little bit. And also kind of poking fun from time to time. Like he's not a dull theologian to read. So there's some parts that I'll read later that I think are good. But from now, we'll pause that. And then do you want to give kind of a summary of what happens in this episode of Death Parade that we just watched?
Right. This one was interesting. It even self-comments this is a slightly less over-the-top episode than maybe other ones in this series. It's a couple that wakes up in the bar, same as the last time. They don't remember each other. They don't really remember anything about their lives for the most part. They are assigned the game of bowling. And in this case, the body parts are in the bowling balls. They feel the heartbeat and body temperature of their opponent in the ball. And the other thing, which honestly I feel like should be an option for real bowling, is you only play one frame. That makes the game so much more fast. I love that.
Yes,
bowling takes forever. Personal. Bowling takes too long. This fixes it. But yeah, one frame bowling, and whoever wins. Pretty much the same thing as always. The two begin to realize over the course of the bowling, through the returning of their memories, that they knew each other, and there's some sort of moment of like shared surprise or trauma. We're not sure which. It's held back from the audience longer than it is for any of the actual people in their lives. That happens right before the bus they were on got hit by some sort of semi-truck or train or something and killed them. In which they were having a realization about each other and their relationship. It turns out that the lady in question, when she went to a different school, she was somewhat unattractive, and the guy she'd always really liked. And she knew that there was one particular person from his life that he had been physically attracted to. So she got plastic surgery in high school, because of course she did, to make her face look like the other person. And it worked because he was attracted to her when he saw her, however many years later, at the bowling alley. And then his friends was like, oh yeah, no, that's not this person that you remember is this other person, the ugly one. She got this plastic surgery to make her look like the one girl, and so they both know this. They both basically just don't bother with it being an issue in their relationship once they come to this understanding, even though they're dead. They're like, well, we do actually like each other.
Yeah.
So let's just, we're done with the bowling. We're in a bar. Let's just have a great date before we're, dead, so to speak. Which is what they do, and they have a good old time. And then they're escorted to the elevators, and it's unclear with the smiley frowny faces what their orientation is, but the elevators are very strongly color coded consistently throughout the series. One for up and one for down. The chap goes into the up, and the lady goes into the down. And so you might think cursory that kind of makes sense because you could make an argument that he was being very nice to a stalker.
Yeah.
It is kind of stalkery to have facial surgery to make you look like the person that the person's attracted to get them to fall for you.
Yes.
But it did seem genuine that he liked her. Even with that. But, you could say, okay, that's fair because he's being a stand-up guy. But I also think there's an element of, what she did was kind of stalkery, but she didn't do it she didn't follow him around or anything. She knew that no matter how much she tried, even if he liked her as a person, he wasn't going to like her in a way that made for romance. Yeah. And so she did a slightly more extreme version of what many people do with clothing or dieting or whatnot to attract a mate, or at least the mate that they think they want.
Whereas, well, I don't know if plastic surgery quite goes into that category.
I mean, a lot of people do plastic surgery. Yeah, so it's not. Hers was with a very specific individual in mind, but fundamentally, a lot of people get plastic surgery and do all kinds of things to try to get a mate.
That's true.
And that's what she did. And you could also argue that since she was in high school, she was at a young enough age that really parental guidance maybe should have been engaged in a way that it wasn't. It's not. You could say this isn't fully teenage hormones being what it is. You can't fully blame her for taking that action, not having some sort of societal correction for it.
Right.
And she wasn't creepy or mean or weird about it, and she didn't go out and actually stalk him. She continued to live her life normally. And then what she had hoped happened. He genuinely saw her and was like, oh yeah, she's awesome. I'm into her now. And so you could make the argument that actually she's the one that should go up, because it took her getting plastic surgery for this guy to actually pay her proper attention.
Yeah.
Whereas, it's clear that they actually did genuinely get along. So isn't that maybe on him for not recognizing what was in front of him the whole time just because of the exterior looks?
Yeah. I will say, having watched the episode while I was watching it, they do a good job of keeping the suspense, right, throughout the episode, because these little bits of memory are coming back, and she says, like, oh, I am, I remember my name, and my name is, like, I'm this girl. And then, like, later she kind of stops for a second and goes, hold on a minute. No, that's the girl that I, tried to copy my face after. That's not actually who I am. And she's like, actually, my name is this. And so, like, they show little flashbacks of the two being shocked by different things, and I'm thinking the whole time, I'm like, is there some sort of like murder or something that happened, or like what
especially
sinister thing?
What happened beforehand, you're expecting some horrible murder or something.
Totally. And then it actually ends up just being this kind of like socially awkward case of unrequited love, and that's and so it's nice the way that the episode ends is that the arbiter, the guy that's standing and watching, and the bartender, you could say, he allows them to kind of have a last and first date together.
Yes.
In the facilities, so they're walking around and they're they have a drink at the bar and they talk with each other, and they and I think that's like a nice, I don't know, it's a nice close to this very odd story. But it it's a very soap opera-ish story, right? Like she got the other person's face put onto her face, and woo,
Yes.
you know, like this. I mean, when does that actually happen, right? But
It doesn't, but yeah,
it's
it works when you're you're two-dimensional.
yes,
Pun intended.
and it's a thought experiment, right? Like I think
is.
they're posing a question. I think so. Like if you were to try to put the question out of what they're like, what the authors or the creators are trying to ask through this, right? What they're kind of begging the question of, like how would you summarize it? I'll give you mine, and then you
Okay, yeah, go
and
for
then
it.
you give me yours. I think that what they're trying to ask is something to do. Like I think you started to hit on it. I think it's kind of the question of like, what are the ethics of like attraction and how attraction works, and like, can somebody be faulted for not being attracted to somebody else? Can they like should somebody be, so is it ethically okay to be so infatuated with somebody that you go to such extremes as getting your facial surgery, right, or something along those lines? Like I think that's the kind of question they're asking, or something along those lines. But what do you think?
I think that's right. And what I like about this show is because of how they present it, even though I don't necessarily think they're going for it, it does also pose the opposite question of is it okay to not engage with someone because you aren't physically attracted to them, even if you're attracted to them in other ways? Where does in essence, where does physical attraction as a means of desirability for a couple, where's the line for that from a moral perspective? That's what they're looking at.
Yes.
And perhaps because of the poor angles of the faces, where we don't get to fully see for sure if they go up or down, there is also then an acknowledgement of an unclarity from the writers of the show as to what the answer to those questions is. I think maybe that's a reflection of where society is right now. I'm not sure we have a definitive answer of the role of attractiveness when it comes to mating from a moral perspective.
Yeah.
I'd be fascinated to hear if you think there's a biblical answer to this or not.
It's yeah. I think that's hard.
It is, because I can think of examples in either direction there.
Yeah, I would say this. I think there are things that we can see were culturally normative at the time that the scriptures were written that I don't necessarily think mean that's the ethic that we should approach for now. But I think that the entire idea of like selective partnership in the way that it's commonly practiced nowadays with relationships, I think it is very far from. I mean, like it's not what I think. It's just true. It's very far from the systems of approach for that kind of relationship even today in like different parts of the world, right? Like arranged marriage was kind of the norm, and so like if you take that to be the let's say to take that to be the biblical norm, and what I mean by biblical is like having to do with the biblical story, not the ethical norm, right? But
right.
If you read that into the scriptures and say like, okay, every time they talk about marriage, they're talking about an arranged marriage. Right. I think it makes sense of a lot of things that don't make sense to us now.
Yes,
right?
That's true. There's a mental separation that has occurred, which makes it difficult for people to even comprehend the mindset of a lot of decisions people made back then.
So I think that there's obviously pros and cons to the modern approach to like the selected marriage of like I choose this person, and I think the pro of it is that the people that end up getting married do genuinely want to be with each other and not just be in a form of relationship like that, but specifically with each other. And so I think it adds to the likelihood of these things remaining for a longer period of time, because it sounds like the way that that Jewish culture worked, with the Mosaic Law and how one could go about with divorce. People were divorcing their wives constantly. Like it was just like this, like it was a ridiculous overuse of the exemptions, right? And that's why Jesus has to say, like, what God has joined together, let no man separate, is because there was just this complete abuse. So I think that, like, even the divorce rate now in America might not have been more than what these people were dealing with. I have no stats for that, so I don't know, but like,
I doubt they kept those stats back then.
No, I don't think so. But I think that the con of selective marriage is that it adds this aspect of pressure to adolescent life and up through, maybe 30 to sometimes 40 years old, where people have this, like, almost this, like, spirit quest that they go on to try to find a soulmate. And for those who have a harder time with decision making, I think it can be like a paralyzing reality, like this. And so I think, the other thing that's kind of a question mark over all of this is, if I choose to love somebody that way from the get-go, is not that love based on selfishness, right? Isn't it based around my attraction and whether or not I'm being pleased by the other person, right? And I think that's a real question that we need to grapple with, because, like, it's our modern day marriages are oftentimes built on a foundation of eros before they're built on a foundation of agape, right? That they're built on a consuming love before they're built on like an unconditional or giving love.
Yep.
And I think that can be damaging. So, yeah. What do you think, though?
I think you've pretty much hit the nail on the head with all of that. Yeah, and I don't have anything else to add. I think you nailed it.
So here's a through line then.
The conclusion of this is that there isn't a conclusion yet, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I don't think it would be wise for us to say one way or another what's right or wrong. I think that would be a binding that's not entirely helpful or pastoral, right? But I think that one thing that we need to watch for, especially as Americans who deal with this kind of stuff all the time anyways, like the indulgence culture, we need to watch for, like, I think we have become so self-determined in our culture that I think that self-determination feels like real, like, right to us. Well, like, it feels ethical. Self-determination is what's right.
Yes.
Whereas the scriptures do not say that. They say self-determination is the first key to being able to control your life, and the freedoms that you have around you is great. It's good. But it is only good if it is used towards the end of then enslaving yourself and submitting yourself to the will of God. And I think that that's where we mess up, is we have a distorted view of what's good. And so when we have these impulses towards what we think is good, and we have the freedom to grab at them ourselves, right? To choose our own partner, to choose the way that we live our life, to choose our own food. I mean, like, food might be the easiest way to see this, right? Like, the amount of unhealth in American dieting is just, like, ridiculous, because we just choose what's good, but it's not actually good, because we have a distorted understanding of what's good, and we need to submit our understanding to a higher understanding of what's good. So anyhow, that's like one thing that we need to be really cognizant of, and I see this a lot in the questions surrounding like homosexuality in the church is a big one now. I think that if we were to dethrone sexual urges as the like impulse towards marriage, right? Like as the motivation for marriage, and we were to center marriage around a desire to see the good of the other, right? Like the good of my neighbor in a very up close and personal way, and to reenact the kind of self-giving love that Christ had for the church. Then I think that we would be able to say to somebody who is saying, well, I'm attracted to this kind of person, your attractions should not govern you in that sense, right? Your attractions should not root you. But the problem is that we're hypocrites, because we say, sexuality, is not all you are, but then we talk up marriage as like the one place to and basically it's focused on, it's concentrated on my attractions and my urges and getting like satisfaction from me, right? Which is completely like solipsist. It's bad. It's a narcissistic approach to marriage, and so it's bad both in the homosexuality world and in the heterosexuality world. Neither of them are justified. The problem is that it's harder to see the intentions as wrong than to see the actions as wrong. So we clamp down hard on homosexuality, but we don't clamp down hard on the root problem, which is in both of them, right? So anyways, that's
there's an old sci-fi movie called The Forbidden Planet, 1956.
Isn't that C.S. Lewis?
He also had a series. It totally unrelated to each other.
Oh, okay, all right.
There's no way that these are related to each other.
Okay.
But it is about the destructive nature of the id, so to speak. And people have had 70 years to watch this movie, so hopefully it's not too much of a spoiler. The principal person that this is about, his mind has synced up to a computer of this planet. And he doesn't realize it. He's been spending all of his time trying to figure out why the civilization that existed on the planet, which was extremely advanced, went extinct in a single night. Like, how does that happen?
Wow.
And he discovers when a ship lands and a monster starts attacking the ship. It's the first ship that's landed on the planet since he crashed there with his daughter. He realizes as the movie progresses that the monster is actually him. It's his id embodied by the computer of the planet that's synced up to his mind. That's what caused the civilization to go extinct in a single night. The computer acted out the will of the id of every individual on that planet simultaneously, which resulted in everyone being killed by everyone else. And
wow.
So
that's fascinating.
The movie ends with him essentially tackling his own subconscious, as it were, wrestling with the secret desires of his heart that is unconstrained by this machine. That's
really the human problem in a nutshell, right? Like,
and
that's
even more so the American one in a lot of ways, I would argue.
Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah. That's wow, that's really good. So then I think, to try to tie the two of these together, God falls in love with this man Israel, this man Abram, and his posterity. And, you could say it is Abram's righteousness, his faithfulness that God falls in love with. But you see some parts of the story where Abram's not so faithful, and holy heck do you see the unfaithfulness of his posterity. So his children are not prime citizens, right? They're not covenant partners that are, above reproach. So I think, perhaps this is to anthropomorphize the question too much, and I don't want to just do a theology where I'm studying what I would do if I was God, because I'm not God. But I do think it's an interesting question of, does God's love have a form of eros to it, or is it pure agape, right? And again, these are categories that theologians have debunked, right? This kind of, but they're just Greek as far as like their relation to the Greek words. But like, or biblical scholars have, but I think they're helpful to kind of get an idea, right? So the eros love is the consuming love. It's the love that I think, as C.S. Lewis puts, it's like the love that desires to like to look into the other, right, and to just like to almost like get lost in them, right? That kind of romantic love. Eros comes from that erotic, right? Erotic love. And then there's agape, which is the one that most Christians will have heard of before, but it's the word for a more let's say committed form of love. Regardless of what happens, I'm here, So what do you think? Is there any trace of erotic love in God? And again, not necessarily sexual, but like specifically the consuming form of love.
I think most likely so. Sodom and Gomorrah come to mind in a way. And as a fiery, consuming, very, very painful for the people involved love. I don't think God acts purely out of hatred. I think him being a multifaceted, complex being, he has more than one emotion when he does any given act. And so people that have rejected him, I think there is an element of love in the consequences that he enacts on them. I don't think it's fully out of. I don't think it's fully self-motivated. And I think there is a passion involved in it, so to speak. But it's more of an impression that I have than something I have a concrete systematic theology to back.
Sure, and I think whether or not that is a Hebrew, let's say eisegesis, like a form of reading onto God's personhood, a passion that's felt deeply in humanity, or whether that because Hebrew is a very passionate language and culture and very gut driven and idiomatic, but whether it's that or it is like it really is the essence of God and God, or it's something to do with God, right? Whether passion has some binding on God. It is definitely the case that as you read, especially the Old Testament, you see this continual passion at the heart of God. And that's not to say a quick-temperedness, because he is very long-tempered, right? Like he allows the city to go unarrested for a long time, right? Same with Israel. He sends centuries worth of prophets to them, and there's no change. But there is definitely the sense that you get some sort of a passion in God. So then I'll change I'm gonna tweak the question to reflect maybe a bit of a more difficult one. Is there any selfishness in God's love?
God is a unique case because of his being such a powerful being. I would say selfishness implies a self-absorption that is excluding everyone else around you. It is a fully self-embraced thing. And whereas I think that God has a certain self-orientation that is constructive in a way it wouldn't be for a human being, because he is the pinnacle of everything, so to speak, and we are not. I do think that there is a nature to God, as is demonstrated, especially in many ways in the Old Testament. There's an aspect to God which is non-self-oriented in decision making, hence our even existing. I think one could argue.
Yes.
And so I'm not sure the word fully works in the context of God. Once again, because of there being more to him, a multifacetedness to his decisions and to the way that he thinks that's even beyond the way we can comprehend.
Yes.
I think there is a self-orientedness aspect of God because of him being the pinnacle. I think there is a selflessness orientation to God because of his nature as well. I think both of those exist simultaneously.
Yes.
And
that's good.
decisions are therefore made with both aspects in mind. And the amazing thing about God, because his nature is one that we see with Christ of being a servant to his own creation, a self-decision is also by its nature of his nature being non-self-oriented, a selfless one. And once again, that doesn't work for anyone else other than God. But it does work for God. His nature being a selfless one means a selfish act is a selfless act. That is not a human achievable thing.
Right.
But it is a God-natured thing.
Yeah, you almost think of, like, I'm thinking about it, I have a picture in my head of, like, a human selfishness is, you could say, it's direct selfishness. In the sense that it is me for myself. And in God's sense, it's like an indirect selfishness. Or a indirect self-centeredness. Because it is willing the good of the other, right? So that's the Thomas Aquinas approach to love, which I think is, it's good enough. Let's just use it for now. It's willing the good of the other and recognizing that good is myself, right? Especially given the fact that he is the author of creation. He alone truly knows what is good for creation and made us for himself, right? So So there's a recursive aspect to it because it goes out to the neighbor and pulls the neighbor towards the self. But it's indirectly selfish, but it is directly selfless, right? It is motivated by selflessness.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the easier way to put it is God's selfishness created us.
Yes.
So that he could live in union, so that we could live in union with him.
Yes.
Right. God created beings, people, to exist in unity and have genuine joy and enjoyment of spending time with him, which is the epitome of selflessness, and yet was done also for self.
Right.
Which feels almost like a jump to me because I like I said, I don't feel like selfishness works really as a term for God because of the nature of him being the generosity of his existence, as it were. It just isn't really compatible in that sense.
Right, because selfishness in our context always is in competition with selflessness, and there is no competition in God. So they what is selfless is for himself, and what is for himself is for us, right? It is there is no division, there's no competition. Both can exist in fullness in God, because of the limitless qualities, and because really nothing can be taken from him.
And that's the thing is frequently we are able to use human language and thoughts to come to an understanding in some limited way of God, because we are his creation, and he is desiring to be approachable for us, to be able to approach him. That's why Jesus came to a certain extent, so that we can actually be in union with him. That requires a certain imitation on our part, and therefore a certain comprehensibility of who he is for us. At the same time, there are times where we have language which is essentially uniquely human because of our fallen nature, and I think maybe we've hit on one of those moments with selfishness.
Yeah.
Where it's almost more a term for us to describe sins that we have than it is something that's useful for understanding God.
Right. Yeah. So I think then the question of the parallelism, right? Because I do, maybe a more grounded parallelism is that it's not so vaguely God with all things that exist that we need to compare our forms of love to, but rather specifically, and I think especially in the marital context, Christ and the church, which is a more, let's say, a more embodied approach to love, less abstract, less conceptual, right? So whether this is a question that's plagued me before, and I don't really know what to do with. I don't know what the answer would be, but like I wonder whether Christ loves the church because she is unlovable or unattractive, or because he or whether he loves the church because she is attractive to him. I think that's and I'm again, like, it's human language, but like, does he see something intrinsically valuable in the church that he himself wants to unite himself with, or is it truly, and I veer towards this, is it truly and completely that he gives of himself and values of himself this other, like, without
I'm going to take it back to Israel, I think, with this. The person, in this case, not the nation.
without gaining anything. That's what I was going for. There you go.
Yeah. I think Israel gets the name from when he wrestles, right? He has that wrestling match. And he gets the name Israel as a result. And do you remember what it means?
Oh, he gets he who contends with God.
Yeah, or wrestles with God.
Yeah.
And of that, he literally did that. I think that's important because it's not he who rejected God; it wrestles with. Which is to say, you're not going to obey mindlessly, and you're not going to reject mindlessly. You are going to wrestle, and not oftentimes, you'll probably lose a fair bit with it, but you are going to actually engage with God in shall we say, a competitive and at times aggressive manner. And there's a struggle inherent with that, right? And the church, we're probably skipping ahead a few chapters in the book we're reading, but the church is, I think you could argue, a continuation of the spirit of that Israel, that wrestling with God. And so I don't know if attraction is the right term for it, but whatever that is, God seems to desire in us for us to obey him in the context of a will that we have of our own that is wrestling with his will, and yet in the end is still worshiping him. And that seems to be what God's going for. That's why I think he picked Israel, the people, and Israel, the name, to describe them. And why he partnered with them is his representation to us, to a certain extent, of what a Christian mindset, not necessarily lifestyle, but mindset is in the context of God.
Yeah.
It's why we do theology. It's not to just mindlessly obey. It is to wrestle with the nature of who God is.
Yeah. And I do hold to some things that come from a very, like, early approach to theology, and reek of a more, like, rigidly dogmatic approach to theology, like divine simplicity. I don't think that God has competing wills or competing attributes within himself that are, like, trying to get the spotlight I think God is one, like completely and solely one, and his attributes are all, you could say, manifestations of the one will, in different scenarios. And so in that sense, I think the difference between us and God is that our will is so divided and divorced and split in so many directions that when we attempt to love as God loves, we can't imagine it. We can't imagine having only one will. And it seems to me that the one will of God is to be in union with his creation. Like, it seems to me that is, I mean, maybe there's more to be said there, but it seems that like the unified, or the singular mission of God from all eternity, right? Because it talks about like before the world was created, before the earth was established, we were predestined in the Son for this inheritance. And so I think it's not that it's like God is. I don't think God ever has like a plan B. I don't think God ever has like a, well, I'll settle for this. I think he has one vision and one mindset and one will. And I think maybe that's part of our problem, is that we're so divided, and that like when we try to talk about loving as God loves, we can't even conceptualize what that would be like, because we haven't been completed yet, right? We haven't been made to love our Creator in the way that he loves us.
Yeah.
But
if I'm to try to... Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
But the beauty is that in the end, I think that's what we're promised. We will know in full. And I think that's that is the eternity that's set before us, is to love from the basis of full and complete union with the Son. And to love the Father from that vantage point is an undying and singular love.
Yeah. To land the plane, maybe this is where it does tie in with Jensen's description of Abraham as being this, like, we don't know why he was chosen this, right? Because that's part of what we're touching on, is we don't know why God really wants us to be in union with him at the end of the day. We it seems pretty clear he does. We don't know why.
Yeah.
Especially when we look at the fallenness of our own nature, we really don't know why.
Right.
But and we don't know why he wanted to create all of this and us, and why he wants to exist within the context of it. But he seems to have done that in the form of Jesus, and it was something he desired to do. And that is the question to a certain extent, and it's not necessarily one that has an easy answer. I like to think of that as the start of heaven. Because heaven is not going to be boring, I don't think.
No.
And humans have this innate desire to seek out and understand and pursue and explore. And so that's, I think, the beginning of heaven, as it were, is that eternal pursuit of God and attempt to answer that question we have in a way that we can't do now fully in this fallen form on this fallen earth, but we will be able to do in heaven for an eternity, which is kind of exciting. It's this never-ending mission of exploration and understanding of an infinite being, which is amazing and something I'm really rather looking forward to.
Yeah, and beyond even the knowing, and I think that the knowing is essential for humanity, because we are composite. Our knowing does not necessarily translate to our loving or our submitting to or our actions. We have a more, let's say, broken down and complex way of interacting with the world. And that's not actually a merit, right, for us. It's not like, we're so complex. No, it's like that's actually what ruins us a lot of the time, is we're so divided from ourselves. But I think we will not only know, but we will finally be free to love God as we were intended to do from the beginning. And I think that is, I've told kids before, like, if you think that getting to heaven, right? And I'm trying to get rid of that language too, because, like, you know, I'm pretty firmly convinced that it's a new creation that we're stepping foot into, and not just, you know, like heaven. Like, we're not just gonna float around with harps, but I think, I've told kids before, like, if what you're looking forward to is just like a place where all your wildest desires are met, if you're looking for a place where, like, you'll get all the donuts that you want or whatever, then you don't understand heaven, because the eternity that we look forward to is an eternity of being obedient to Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And so if you think, like, I'm going to be obedient here, and that will earn me my ticket into a place where I don't have to, like, stress so much. Like, I think it's true that it will be a rest, right? Like, the obedience will be rest, but it will be obedience.
Yeah.
Right? It's not what will pause in eternity is our own self-will that's you know, constantly pushing back against Christ and you know, seeking good in other places, right? So what we really are losing, as Paul says, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me, right? It's coming to let's say a center of life that stems only out of obedience to Jesus and unification with him. So, man, there's so much more in this chapter that I wanted to talk about, but we're at an hour, which I knew this would happen. So maybe we can talk about more stuff later. I don't know. Maybe I'll release my own little podcast reflecting on some other stuff. Like, his description of the talkative God. Oh, I loved that.
Yeah.
But anyways.
I think a lot of this will also tie in with itself as we keep going, which will be good.
Yes. Yeah, that's my hope. All right. Well, thanks so much for listening to this episode of Sophomoros, and this discussion with me and Kevin. We'll be back to do another one, and probably next month. Yeah.
Yeah, and homework this time. It's episode 4 and chapter 3. We're gonna do some double episodes, just not quite yet. So chapter 3 and episode 4.
Yes, and I can't wait for next episode to finally make a comment about episode 4 that I've been meaning to make for so long. So thanks so much for listening to this episode. Thank you, Kevin, for talking with me. I always enjoy our conversations. If you would like to reach out to us, shoot us a topic, a question, comment, any of that kind of stuff, you can reach us at sophomorosofficial@gmail.com. That's SOPHOMOROSOFFICIAL at gmail.com. And we'll get back to you as soon as we can. And until then, may Christ be exalted.